Welcome and thank you for joining us today for WAN Transformation with SD-WAN, establishing a mature foundation for SASE Success. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is Shamus McGillicuddy, VP of Research covering network management at EMA. Shamus has more than 16 years of experience in the IT industry as an industry analyst and journalist. His research focuses on all aspects of managing enterprise networks. And before I hand things over to Shamus, I wanted the audience to know that he will be concluding today's event by taking your questions. Feel free to log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA with the on-demand playback and some additional resources about this new research. So I hope you'll check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Shamus McGillicuddy. Shamus?
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar about our latest research on enterprise WAN transformation. I want to start by thanking the sponsors of this research. The way I do research is I solicit sponsorship from vendors in the community. They have no say into the writing of the report. They just sponsor, financially support the research. They get to see what kind of data I'm planning to collect. They get to have the data and use it in their own marketing, things like that, but they don't actually see the report until it's published. So they're just there to sponsor some vendor independent third-party research that provides insight to customers into what's going on in the world of networking. So I thank these guys, Broadcom, Cato Networks, Cradlepoint, Juniper Networks, Logic Monitor, Riverbed, all vendors who either provide SD-WAN and SASE solutions and or network observability solutions, all of which we'll be discussing today. So let's just start briefly by taking a look at this agenda, which is short and to the point. We're going to start briefly talking about research goals and methodology, so you know where I'm coming from. Then we'll talk about how SASE, which stands for Secure Access Service Edge, requires a software-defined WAN foundation in order to be successful. That's my opinion. Others may share it. I think that people aren't paying enough attention to that, and that's why I'm doing this research. Also, after that, we'll talk about how you build that foundation with SD-WAN, and then how we'll close out with how you get to SASE from SD-WAN successfully. There are multiple paths to get there as well. So research goals and methodology. I've been doing research on enterprise WAN transformation, as I call it, since 2016. Every 2 years, we survey hundreds of IT organizations about what they're doing with hybrid WAN, increasing their use of the internet, enabled by software-defined WAN. And so every 2 years, we ask enterprises through a survey and through one-on-one interviews with multiple stakeholders inside of Fortune 500 companies and the like. What are you doing? How do you procure? How do you implement? How do you operate your SD-WAN implementations as your WAN changes from being MPLS-centric to hybrid internet-based? So we've been looking at that. This is I believe the 4th iteration of this research going back to 2016. Last one was done in late 2021, I believe. So we wanted to refresh that research. We also wanted to see, SASE has emerged over the last few years as the end goal of SD-WAN. Everyone's evolving SD-WAN into SASE, and we'll talk about that in a second, what that means. But how is that transition going? Because I've heard anecdotally that it doesn't always go well. How can SD-WAN be a foundation for that? How can you make sure that when you go from SD-WAN to SASE, the SD-WAN that you have provides that foundation for a successful transition? So that was the goal. We surveyed 313 IT professionals who had responsibility either directly or indirectly as an executive or manager of people for their wide area networking. You see the job titles here, lots of middle management types like directors and managers and supervisors, but also network architects, network engineers, some C-level people, IT groups was a mix of network engineering people, CIO suite, architecture types, IT governance people who are thinking about IT asset management, financial management, also some cybersecurity and IT security types, a little bit of NetOps or IT ops, just a cross section of the different types of functions who may have some responsibility or ownership of the wide area network, or securing it, building it, operating it, managing vendor relationships with it. And then, yeah, we had more than a dozen industries in this research, all enterprise for the most part. You see banking, finance, insurance, manufacturing, energy, and retail are the big one. Energy and utilities and retail are the big ones, and also some professional technical services people like law firms or accounting firms, and a little bit of healthcare. And then very big cross section of all types of sizes of enterprises, from the low mid market all the way up to the very large. Lots of multi-billion-dollar companies are in this survey because we also asked them about revenue. And you see it's a transatlantic view of North America and Europe. So SASE requires a foundation of SD-WAN. What is SASE? Multiple definitions out there. The term was coined by someone in another analyst firm that I won't name, although I'm quite friendly with the people over there. But you know, they're the competition, so I'm not going to name them. But anyway, it's an integrated platform for WAN connectivity, cloud-native network security, secure remote access, across a hybrid multi-cloud architecture. That's one way of defining it. And if you look at the functionality, this is kind of a basic architectural view of what it might be. You got the cloud native network security stuff that lives in so-called SASE points of presence. Your SASE vendor might maintain points of presence in infrastructure as a service providers or their own in colo facilities, and they basically deploy all their security services in some degree of integrated stacks, and your traffic on the WAN goes to those POPs and gets the treatment that it needs from the secure WAN gateway, the cloud application security broker, the firewall as a service, the threat protection, and so on. And any number of security services might be in that stack, depending on which vendor you're using or number of vendors you're using. It also usually includes sort of a tangential capability around secure remote access, like a cloud-based VPN might be living in those SASE POPs, or zero trust network access, or some amalgamation of both those concepts. And then on the right, you see in this light green turquoisey color, geez, I don't know what color that is. That's SD-WAN. It looks so insignificant just sitting there on the right, like it's just kind of tacked on, like an afterthought, a button you push to turn it on. And I worry that people think that way, that if you're going to get a SASE solution, it's like all this stuff in the blue and the orange you got to think about, and that little green thing on the end is just like an appendix that maybe you need to cut out if it gets infected. But it's not. It's the foundation. It should be at the top of your request for proposals when you're implementing a SASE project. It's not just a feature. It's a platform that SASE either integrates with or is built on top of. And I believe that too many people are just not taking that to heart. You need a mature SD-WAN platform. Otherwise, when you try to implement SASE, or maybe you're going from nothing, no SD-WAN straight to SASE, you don't get the network piece right. And the network is what connects you to all those POPs I was describing. It's the network that connects you to the application services in the cloud and your data centers and so forth that the SASE POPs are sitting between. If you don't have that network done right, you're gonna mess up. So as it says here at the bottom, SD-WAN failure equals SASE failure. Kind of self-evident, but I think people are overlooking it. And the problem is SD-WAN is not trivial. Our survey, this research that we published late last week says that only 38% of enterprises who are engaged with SD-WAN right now are saying that it's been a complete success. So that tells you that 72% are either unsure or about how they're doing, or know they need to do better. And if that's the case, that 72% is going to have trouble if they want to go from SD-WAN to SASE. The top technical challenges that they identified with their SD-WAN projects: number one, implementation complexity. It's really hard to set this thing up, even though it's supposed to be software defined, which, marketing told me was going to be trivial. It's not. I've got to set up all these tunnels from site to site. I got to translate business policy into technical implementations. I've chosen an SD-WAN vendor that's allowing my network engineers to go in CLI all the time and tweak it that way instead of through a GUI, and it's getting really hard. 24% told us that integration with existing security architecture and policies is hard. And you think of it, that could be the fact that they've got a third-party firewall in all their branches, for instance, that they're married to, and they want to integrate their SD-WAN solution with those firewalls, those unified threat management solutions, whatever. Or they're telling us they're trying to integrate SD-WAN with SASE and it's not going well. It's one or the other, or both. 22% said, hey, it's really hard to bring a new site online. Why is that? Why is it so hard? I thought this was just like, zero touch provisioning. I just plug in a thing, it phones home, it gets all its configuration, it's up and running, and that's not happening for some reason. The WAN underlay is too complex, or maybe that's what's causing it. I don't know. Product stability. So 1 in 5 of them tell us they've got a product that's buggy or crashes. Integration with their cloud providers, because one of the things that's happening here is people don't want to hairpin their traffic into the public cloud through their data centers anymore because it adds too much latency, but they need to integrate their SD-WAN platform with their cloud providers to ensure good cloud on-ramp capability, and that's not going well for everybody. And then just interoperability between multiple SD-WAN solutions. Why would that be? Well, it's because more than 40% of the people in the survey told us they're using more than one SD-WAN vendor, which is odd. We'll touch on that a little bit later. So, as I said, SD-WAN failure equals SASE failure. We asked these people, do you think it's difficult or easy to advance from an SD-WAN platform to a fully integrated SASE solution? When we ask a question like this in research, most of the answers are usually either in the magenta, purpley color there, the 11%, or the brown. They're either saying it's great or it's somewhat great, or easy or somewhat easy. That's where most of the difference usually is in a question like this when I'm asking people, because these are people who are I'm asking them to grade themselves, basically. I'm asking them to say, would you give yourselves an A or B or an F, and how you've done your job as someone who's responsible for migrating from SD-WAN to SASE. And you see here only 11% gave themselves an A. There's 11% say it's very easy. Another almost 26% say it's somewhat easy, it could be easier. And then you see this huge orange slice of the pie of people saying it's kind of hard. And then another 2% plus saying it's hell, it's terrible, this is not going well. And almost a third of them telling us it's neither difficult or hard, which means those are mostly the people who are like still kind of trying to figure out where they're going with SASE. They haven't really gotten that far, probably. So, and what we found in a cross-tab analysis of all the data we collected from these 313 enterprise IT stakeholders was that enterprises who tell us that they are less successful with their SD-WAN implementations are reporting more difficulty with that transition to a SASE solution. Hence the title of this slide. We also found that the longer people are in production with SD-WAN, the more likely they are to report an easy transition, which tells us that they've matured their approach to SD-WAN. People who've only had SD-WAN in production for 3 years or less are having a hard time with that SASE transition. And people said that their SD-WAN solution has been in production for 4 or more years. They're reporting an easier transition. So maturing that SD-WAN solution, make sure the SD-WAN solution is battle tested, is critical. Larger companies told us they were more likely to struggle with that SASE transition. And that's what I've heard anecdotally. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I started this angle on this research. Was I was hearing last year and reading last year that really large companies were finding that transition to SASE really painful. Like I read this one article that quoted a business development executive that one of the largest telecoms in Asia, outside of China, who said that his largest enterprise customers are finding the transition from SD-WAN to SASE really painful. And I was thinking, why? Why is that? Also, the technical experts inside of companies are the ones that are most pessimistic about how easy it is or hard it is to transition to SASE. People who told us they're in a network operations group, a network engineering group, or an IT architecture group were all more likely to say that it's painful to do this. Whereas people in a CIO suite were on cloud nine. It's a gap you see in research all the time. On technical issues, the CIO suite's always feeling good about things, and the people who actually have to get things to work are pulling their hair out of by the roots. So how do you build a solid SD-WAN foundation for that SASE dream? Well, it starts with getting away from DIY implementations. We've been asking about this for a few years now. Like, do you prefer to consume SD-WAN as solutions as a service, a managed service, or do you want to do it yourself? You want to like build this thing, screw on all the bolts and hammer in all the nails and get it up and running, get those tunnels nice and iron, clear, and connect all those sites yourselves one by one, putting that full mesh network in place. That sounds scary. Building your own full mesh network across a wide area network, that sounds like a lot of fun. Anyway, we've been seeing this steadily shift away from DIY to managed services. You're seeing 66% of the people in the survey said, we really want to consume SD-WAN, or we are consuming SD-WAN as a managed service, and only 21% said DIY. Now, the people who told us that they were consuming SD-WAN as a managed service also were more likely to tell us that their SD-WAN implementation has been successful. Whereas the people who said that they were going DIY were more likely to report difficulty or at least room for improvement. With the exception, we asked people why you preferred a DIY approach. And when people selected strength of the network engineering team, like we have an internal network engineering team is really strong, and we wanted to leverage that in our SD-WAN implementation. Those people who said that that was the reason they went with DIY were more likely than others who were DIY to be successful with SD-WAN. So if you've got a really good network engineering team, and you want to do a DIY implementation, more power to you. But if you're doing DIY SD-WAN implementations because of like strategic vendor relationship that you want to continue to nurture, or you just are afraid of giving up control of your network to a managed service provider, or maybe it's a pricing thing, you think it'd be cheaper if you own it instead of renting it or whatever, those are all bad reasons. You need to, if you're going to do a DIY, it's got to be because you're confident in your engineers to get it done. Managed SD-WAN also correlated, not surprisingly, with people saying that their SASE transition was easier. Aside from the managed SD-WAN overlay, you've got to get the right WAN underlay in place too. And maybe you're sourcing that from the same people. Maybe you're using a global telecom who's offering a managed SD-WAN service. But in a lot of cases, you may have direct relationships with dozens, if not hundreds of network providers. And that's your responsibility, and the managed SD-WAN services providers giving you an overlay on top of your underlay. I mean, a SLA on top of your underlay. Anyway, you've got to get the right underlay in place, whether you're sourcing it separately or together, packaging it with your managed SD-WAN service. And it starts with the internet. 98% of the people in this survey told us that they are increasing the use of the internet as a primary WAN connectivity option across their WAN. And it's not necessarily because they're getting rid of MPLS. Most of them told us that their managed WAN services or their private WAN connections, which translates into dark fiber, MPLS, mostly MPLS. They're hybridizing with MPLS. They're not retiring those bandwidth constrained, more expensive, SLA driven MPLS circuits. They're supplementing them with internet bandwidth. So most of them were either keeping all their MPLS in place and just adding internet to get more total bandwidth on top of their hybrid network, or they're pulling back a little bit on their MPLS bandwidth and replacing it with lots of internet bandwidth, but they were still keeping the core of their MPLS in place. in terms of why they're using more and more internet connectivity, the two big ones were cloud connectivity, being able to connect directly into the cloud from whatever site they have on their WAN. The internet is the best option to do that, so you don't have to keep going through your data center and adding latency to your network to a a direct connection from your data center into your cloud, or using that internet to connect into a SASE POP and then go into your cloud provider. And then network flexibility is just you're able to make changes, respond to the needs of your business more quickly. When you have more bandwidth and the internet connectivity is just easier to provision, days or weeks instead of months versus an MPLS provider. That's how long it takes them to turn up a site. In addition to just adding more bandwidth, people are also thinking about the middle mile when they've got all this internet connectivity in place. If they're a global or large regional enterprise that has maybe they're in on both ends of a large continent, or they're in 5 continents. When you're using the internet a lot, SD-WAN solutions are primarily focused on optimizing the performance of your first and last mile internet connections, right? So the middle mile is usually best effort if it's going across the internet. So a lot of people are starting to think about how they optimize that middle mile when there's a lot of internet connectivity in their hybrid WAN. And 33% of them told us that they're backhauling that traffic off of their internet onto their MPLS provider to ensure that when they are doing global that the global network traffic is engineered in such a way that it's getting the performance of that private network that they've still got in place. They just have to integrate their SD-WAN's platform into that, set it up so that the traffic is routed properly and kept off of the public internet when it's going, let's say, from New York to Shanghai, for instance. 30% said that they attempt to use middle mile optimization via SD-WAN points of presence. Some SD-WAN vendors, for instance, maintain global POPs that started out as points of presence on the network that they use to optimize internet traffic across the global internet backbone. Your traffic would come from the SD-WAN edge, go into their POPs, and then the POPs would be monitoring network connections across the internet and pick the best route for your traffic to go in order to get there as quickly as possible. And 30% said they're doing that. And actually, that 30% were doing quite well with SD-WAN in general, by the way. Those people tended to be having a good SD-WAN experience using those middle mile POPs. Not necessarily the best practice, but it was working for them. And then 17% told us that they have an SD-WAN provider that has an integrated private backbone. There's quite a few SD-WAN vendors now that have either partnered with somebody or they maintain their own private network backbone to deliver that middle mile network performance. They're not just dealing with your first mile, last mile, but they're also delivering a service that includes the middle mile with a global network. And that can be quite useful as well, obviously. And then a lot of people are looking towards wireless WAN connectivity. 86% told us that they're adding 4G and 5G connectivity to their WAN these days. And 97% of that 86% said that they're using it for primary WAN connections for at least some of their sites or applications, not just a wireless backup for if the terrestrial connection on your branch office goes down, but actually using it for primary WAN connectivity in situations. You think of the industrial edge, the agricultural edge, oil and gas extraction that's far away from good network connections, for instance. Rural ISP is not doing so well for your call center. Maybe you want to supplement it with some 5G bandwidth, for instance. And 88% of people who are using or planning to use wireless WAN connectivity in their overall WAN footprint said that they're integrating or planning to integrate it with their SD-WAN solution. So that means not just plugging a little 4G, 5G dongle into your SD-WAN edge appliance and getting that connectivity added to the network footprint at the edge, but actually having that 4G, 5G connectivity integrated into the edge appliance and allowing the SD-WAN controller to use it as a first-class option for hybrid WAN connectivity, as it's building building and executing on policy around where certain applications are forwarded to onto the network. Like, oh, this application is best effort. We're just going to put on the internet bandwidth. This application is critical. I'm going to put on the MPLS. This application, I think this is a good application to go on the 5G connection. So now you have that option. And we found that strong wireless WAN, SD-WAN integration, people who are the most satisfied with the integration that their SD-WAN provider offers with wireless WAN, we're having an easier transition with SASE. So they're leveraging a broader, more diverse set of network connectivity options across their network, and that's leading to a better SASE transition. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're going to lean on wireless WAN connectivity, 4G, 5G connectivity, or any other wireless connectivity for that option, you got to think about how well it integrates with your SD-WAN solution and how that will reverberate down to the transition to SASE. Like for instance, if you have bad integration between SD-WAN and wireless WAN, maybe you find yourself struggling with the fact that your SD-WAN solution is really good at forwarding traffic over your MPLS connection and your broadband cable business circuit to your SASE POPs, but for some reason it keeps failing to forward traffic from your 5G dongles to the SASE POPs, and it's not, it's creating holes in your security architecture. WAN acceleration is important. What is WAN acceleration? Well, before the internet came along, everyone was using WAN optimization. I mean, before the internet became an enterprise WAN option, everyone was using WAN optimization to maximize their MPLS bandwidth using things like deduplication, TCP optimization, stuff like that, to accelerate their networks and maximize their bandwidth on those bandwidth constrained MPLS circuits. And now they've got all this internet, and the thought is, well, I got all this internet connectivity, unlimited bandwidth, I get all the performance I could hope for. No, bandwidth doesn't necessarily mean performance. Like I'm supposed to have 120 megabits of connectivity in my home office, and some days it goes down to 0.5. Goes down to like 500 kilobits. It's very frustrating. Interferes with webinars like this. Hopefully it's not happening right now. But anyway, a lot of SD-WAN, a lot of WAN optimization vendors migrated or created SD-WAN offerings that leverage their existing WAN optimization capabilities. And that can lead to better performing SD-WAN. So 71% said they're using WAN acceleration to improve application performance, and the more successful SD-WAN implementations are also doing it. I think that some of the people in the survey may also have interpreted like WAN remediation features like forward error correction as an acceleration capability. That's a little different. Others may have interpreted this as using things like dynamic path selection. You have a SD-WAN vendor that's keeping an eye on the health and performance of the different circuits on a site, and it makes forwarding decisions based on the conditions on each of those links, and that could be seen as WAN acceleration as well. There are lots of different ways to define it, I guess, but 71% say they've implemented something, and 89% of the people who say they're using WAN acceleration say they're using something offered by their SD-WAN vendor, which tells you a lot of them are not using traditional WAN optimization, but might be actually doing something a little different, like what I just described. 42% of people apply that acceleration across all network paths, and those people were doing the best with SD-WAN. Less successful people say they were only devoting WAN acceleration, like paying for that WAN acceleration licensing and implementing it on branch to data center connectivity or branch to cloud connectivity. But the people who say, I'm going to just roll this out everywhere to ensure that the entire network's optimized, those people were doing the best. And incidentally, users of WAN acceleration in general, people who said they're using WAN acceleration, reported easier transitions to SASE. Again, an indicator of how to build that SD-WAN foundation is to include that WAN acceleration feature. So one other thing that's really important is making sure that you have good observability of your SD-WAN with hybrid operations. Now, I mentioned that well over 60% of the people in the survey told us that they consume SD-WAN as managed service, but only 15% of people in the survey say that they completely outsource day two operations like change management, monitoring, troubleshooting, maybe security incident response. Instead, the vast majority of them embraced a hybrid SD-WAN operating model where they share responsibility with their managed service provider. And those people, the people that had that hybrid SD-WAN operating model, were telling us they were having the easier transition to SASE. They have better visibility into their network environment. This can be helpful, for instance, when they're trying to figure out what's going on with their SASE POPs. Like maybe suddenly one of their SASE POPs goes down, they've got a separate vendor for SD-WAN who's not necessarily managing the health and performance of individual SASE points of presence, but the internal network operations team is pinging those POPs on a regular basis and sees one's has gone down and goes to their managed SD-WAN vendor and says, could you please route traffic from this region to this other POP that's, going to add a little bit of latency, but at least it's up and running. You can also think it's not just a day two operations thing, but it also can be a design thing. You're designing your network. You want to make sure that you're picking the best. You're picking the best locations for each traffic engineering decision you make around where your SASE POPs are in relation to your WAN edge locations, your branches, and so forth. Now, when it comes to SD-WAN operations, a lot of people think about the fact that SD-WAN has a native monitoring capability. Every SD-WAN solution gives you native network and application performance and traffic visibility. They give you good visibility into the network overlay they create, all the tunnels that you have from site to site, and 40%, which is actually pretty good, say they are fully satisfied with the native SD-WAN monitoring features that they have. They do see some challenges with it. The biggest ones were data granularity. Like a lot of SD-WAN solutions do not collect data at intervals that are sufficient for full visibility. There might be missing things. If they turn up the interval on that collection too much, it might hit the performance of the network just based on how their SD-WAN vendor built their product, and so they're running into roadblocks there. Also unhappy with data retention. Maybe they want to store their monitoring data from their SD-WAN solution for more than a year, and the SD-WAN solution doesn't offer that in their cloud-based controller and console. They're not getting any or enough security information in the native monitoring. I don't think a lot of traditional SD-WAN vendors started with offering that. Maybe as they move to SASE, they start getting into that. But a lot of people want to get security insights in their network management platforms these days, and that's not there for them. And then data is summarized. So you get to tier 2, tier 3 response. The network engineering team wants to drill down into the data that they see represented in a dashboard. And when they get there, they see that data has been discarded. It's just a summary. They can't get into the packets or whatever. So what are a lot of enterprises doing? They're monitoring SD-WAN with third-party tools. 73% said they're doing that. And we've seen that for a while now, that there's interest in that. And you see a lot of vendors in the network performance management space who add and integrate with and support multiple SD-WAN vendors. They're usually doing that in response to requests from their customers. 2 in 5, 40% or so, said that their third-party monitoring of SD-WAN was good enough. But so most of them were looking for improvement. And when we asked them what kinds of issues they were having with their third-party monitoring of SD-WAN, their third-party tools lack the ability to provide an end-to-end visibility across the overlay and the underlay. Because chances are, like, the SD-WAN console is where all the overlay intelligence lives, and then they're doing direct data collection from the WAN underlay from ISPs and so forth in their third-party tool, and they might have good underlay visibility there, and they're struggling to bring those 2 points of view together, especially since there's so many MPM vendors and so many SD-WAN vendors. Like, it takes time for all those to integrate well. A lot of people do it themselves using open APIs, so it's not always great. So that's an issue. Poor visibility into SD-WAN tunnels. Like, it's the native monitoring tools of SD-WAN are going to probably give you good visibility into that, but your third-party tools aren't getting a lot of insight there. So if you're relying primarily on your third-party monitoring tool for SD-WAN, which I've talked to people, they don't bother with the native monitoring tool capabilities of SD-WAN because it's owned by the managed service provider, and they have to do like jump through some hoops to get access to the console. So they're relying 100% on their third-party tool to get that visibility. And so a lot of them are struggling with the fact that they don't have tunnel visibility. And then data quality, like a lot of SD-WAN vendors just generate bad data. They don't necessarily generate it in a format you like, or lots of packet drops or whatever, and you're trying to get that data into your tool. And that's an issue. We also asked these people, are you able to get an end-to-end view of your entire WAN underlay through a single console, like your third-party tool, that can like just tell you like how everything is going across all your ISPs and MPLS providers as far as you can get data out of them? You got good visibility in that. And people who said yes to that question were more likely to report they had a good transition to SASE. So WAN underlay visibility, very important to good SASE transition. This is one enterprise's approach to hybrid ops with SD-WAN. He told us that he wanted his MSP to be responsible for the operational side of things with SD-WAN, and then he just holds them accountable. And how does he hold them accountable? Well, the MSP monitors packet loss, delay, congestion, ISP outages, and then he monitors end user experience. He monitors streaming media, video conferencing, versatile desktop infrastructure. And if he sees issues with that, then he tries to trace it to the WAN. And if he can trace it to the WAN, then he goes to the SD-WAN provider and he says, fix this. This is the vice president of architecture at a $5 billion energy company. I talked to another guy who was head of NetOps for a manufacturer of electrical equipment with like 900 offices across the world, and he had 8 different managed service providers managing different components of his SD-WAN implementation because he couldn't find one MSP that manages it all, which meant that he didn't have one single SD-WAN console that he could log into to see how things are going. So he uses a third-party tool to monitor all 8 of his SD-WAN MSPs. He also uses it to just monitor things from the edge. Like, for instance, he had a factory go down, and he had on-site IT support check on the SD-WAN edge device there to see if it was up, and it was up. But his MSP was not aware that the factory SLA was out of compliance, so he went and did some investigating and found that his ISP in that region had made a change to routing that affected how his traffic went to a cloud provider. And thus that factory lost access to all of its applications in that cloud provider. And so he was able to go to his ISP and his SD-WAN managed service provider and say, this routing change happened, and now my factory's lost access to all of its cloud applications. So that's an example of how hybrid operations is important. So the transition to SASE, charting a path. How do you evolve from SD-WAN to SASE? We asked people. And you see on the left, 54% said that they are integrating or plan to integrate or did integrate a third-party secure service edge solution, like a cloud-based security vendor. There's quite a few out there, with their incumbent SD-WAN solution. So that's a common path that people are taking with SASE. Nearly 31% said that they are following the SD-WAN vendor's lead. They're adopting the SASE capabilities of their SD-WAN vendor, and that's the way they're going. And those people told us those people reported were more likely to report an easier transition to SASE, although I don't think it is necessarily the best way to go. Those people were having an easier time overall in this instance. I'll tell you why I don't think it's always the best way to go in a second. And then 7.6%, almost 8% said that they're doing a net new solution, which tells me that they're probably like either they're one of those few people that hasn't touched SD-WAN yet, or they're like on a second or third generation of SD-WAN. They're like, oh, it's time to rip and replace our old vendor, and I think we're ready to go to a new one because we're never happy with this one to begin with. But hey, we're also just going to do SASE at the same time, so we're doing a net new implementation of SD-WAN and SASE, and that may be a unified solution, or it could be a multi-vendor approach. It's hard to say. And you see there's a small sliver of people who still haven't decided what their SASE path will be. On the left, you see factors that influence whether people use a single SASE vendor or try to cobble together multiple vendors. And we saw well over half are doing the latter. Performance is the big determining factor. They base their decision on how their network will perform when they've implemented SASE, or how they think it will perform. You see management simplicity, platform stability, and cost are secondary drivers of that decision. And then trailing in the 5th place is time to value. At the bottom, you see these orange ones: requirements for best of breed SSE and SD-WAN capabilities, strategic vendor relationships, and pace of innovation. And those were selected by people who reported an easier transition to SASE. And what that tells me is there's a split in which path to go, because if people are driven by are making the decision based on best of breed SSE and SD-WAN capabilities, that tells me they aren't necessarily using one vendor. They're saying to themselves, well, I'm going to use this best of breed SD-WAN solution and this best of breed secure service edge solution, and that means I'm integrating third party with incumbent SD-WAN, or I'm doing a net new solution with separate SD-WAN and SSE capabilities. And those people were not on the left, you see, tagged as having an easier time of it, but here on the right they are. So that tells me that if you are deciding not to follow blindly or knowledgeably down the road your SD-WAN vendor's SASE yellow brick road, that that 30.8% on the left here who said we're doing good, this isn't necessarily bad, this isn't necessarily bad if you're making your decision based on the fact that you're pursuing best of breed capabilities. It just means that you got to make sure that you integrate it well and you follow all the other recommendations that I gave here. And this one, strategic relationships with vendors could drive any of these really, or probably the top two really. And so this one could apply to either of these as well. If you have a strategic vendor relationship that's good and you're confident in their roadmap and their professional services or managed services or whatever, then either of these could be good. And then pace of vendor innovation, that doesn't really tell me anything. It just tells me that people want, to work with a vendor that's constantly putting out new and shiny stuff like, hey, we just introduced AI ops, and oh, good, that's what we want. So finally, just reviewing tips for a successful path to SASE. We kind of covered some of this, a lot of it, when I was talking about how you build a good SD-WAN foundation, but here's some more. So first off, as I mentioned, avoid multi-vendor SD-WAN. 43% of companies told us they have 2 or more SD-WAN vendors today. And there are a lot of reasons for that. You may have more than one. Not going to go into in too much depth right now, but if for whatever reason you have more than one SD-WAN vendor, consolidate if you can, or maybe prioritize which one is going to become SASE now, and try to figure out a way to avoid having too much complexity in the implementation. Second, avoid that DIY SD-WAN solution. Like I said, managed services are the way to go unless you have a really excellent network engineering team. Now, that can help you with the SD-WAN implementation, but does that network engineering team, it may have been able to get you to a DIY SD-WAN nirvana, but can it get you to SASE? You got to think about that, because it might not just be the network engineers that you need there. Then you got to start like bringing in the cybersecurity group that might be more knowledgeable about a lot of the technologies that are in a secure service edge solution. So you got to make sure that if you're going to continue that DIY path, make sure you've got a lot of security expertise as you go from SD-WAN to SASE on the team to implement and operate. Established hybrid day 2 operations. We went through that. Like, you don't want to outsource all your operations to the managed service provider. You're going to need that visibility to maintain SASE excellence. Also, I mentioned establish that end-to-end WAN visibility. You want that strong SASE wireless WAN integration. I mentioned all that. Establish a full mesh topology. We asked people about their topology with SD-WAN. People who said they're primarily implementing like a hub and spoke network with SD-WAN, and people said they had a partial mesh in place were more likely to struggle with their transition to SASE, whereas people who've established that full mesh network where they have lots of any connectivity and they're ready to just add connectivity into the mesh that brings the SASE pops as full participants in that mesh are more likely to succeed with that transition from SD-WAN to SASE. WAN acceleration everywhere. I mentioned that. Like if you should use WAN acceleration, and when you use it, apply it to all paths as much as you can, and that's apparently correlating with SASE success. And don't chase low prices. We asked people, what would prompt you to switch SD-WAN vendors? And the number one response was actually network performance. If I felt like I could get better network performance if I switched to a new SD-WAN vendor, then I'm going to do it. A minority of them, there were other options like, I'm not going to go into now because I don't have it on the top of my head, but one of the options, like I think it was like a secondary, tertiary response was, we're if someone offers us a lower price on our SD-WAN service, we might switch. Those people that selected that reported SASE was a nightmare. So that tells me that if you're looking to do the lowest cost option always, if you're chasing that lower price, you're going to get what you pay for. If you want to have a successful SD-WAN to SASE implementation, you're going to have to pay. You may have to pay a premium, but at the very least, you should base your decisions on price alone. You should be basing it on things like performance and breadth of security offerings and professional support services and customer support, things like that. So with that, this report published last week. This is a link you can click on to download it. It is behind a paywall. I apologize. Some of the sponsors may have some content on their websites, including research summaries or abridged versions of the report that you could download if you want to use Google. And I'm going to turn it over to Raleigh, who will now moderate Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamus. I will be sending a follow-up email that will include the on-demand playback and a link to the report. As Shamus mentioned, we encourage you to also look at the sponsors' sites. I know at least some of them will have the report, and you can also learn more about their solutions. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions, Shamus. The first one is, could you provide more info about why people are using multiple SD-WAN vendors?
Sure. A lot of people told us that they had functional requirements that demanded multiple vendors. They had a need for good site to cloud connectivity, and that forced them to work with one vendor. And then they had like another requirement for like lots of security stuff, and they didn't like what the one vendor did, so they added a second vendor that could provide all the security capabilities, which speaks to the transition to SASE as well. Another one said that the other big driver was site diversity. They got lots of different types of sites. Maybe they got like 500 retail sites, and those need one kind of vendor. Like, oh, this is going to be we're going to use a really cheap vendor that just gives you like really, vanilla bandwidth with some security. But then we have 8 24/7 distribution sites and 5 factories and 2 product engineering sites, and they all need very different types of WAN connectivity. And this second vendor is really good for that. So those are the 2 big ones. And then people often told us that they had multiple business units that were making technology decisions independently. For instance, I talked to one guy who told me that he's a global company and they use one SD-WAN vendor for all of North America and then a second one for all of the rest of the world. And that was just the way his business was run. And he was responsible for both of them. And then I also heard that mergers and acquisitions is like a tertiary thing. Like one guy told me his company is just constantly buying another company every year, and every single company they buy has a different SD-WAN vendor. And it takes a while to rationalize all that. And then another frequent thing is just transitioning from one vendor to another can take years. Like I've talked to people who's like, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've got, we adopted this SD-WAN vendor in 2015 or 2016, and it's been in place ever since. And then in 2021, we decided to do this new vendor, and we've got about 50% of our sites on the new vendor and 50% of our sites on the old vendor. And by the end of next year, it'll be 80-20. So that's happening. And you just got to keep operating your entire network despite all of that, like all those different factors. It's like you can't just like switch overnight. You can't tell different business units what to do if they have independence. It's just a big mess. So yeah, those are the reasons why.
Thanks for those insights. The second question is, if people are 40% satisfied with native SD-WAN observability, why are so many using third-party tools for SD-WAN monitoring?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, most of the satisfaction with native SD-WAN capabilities is pretty high. 40% are completely satisfied, and I think like another 50% were somewhat satisfied. And when we ask people to identify what challenges they have with that native monitoring capability, I think like maybe 17 or 18% said none. We have no significant challenges, which is extremely high. When you ask people, if you give people a multiple choice question that says, name your challenges, and then at the bottom you say none of the above, we're happy with everything. Usually like 4, 5, 6% will hit that none of the above. And so here it was like 3 times higher, which tells me that generally the native monitoring capabilities of your typical SD-WAN vendor is strong, but its scope is limited. Like I alluded to earlier, it's primarily focused on the overlay. It's often owned by a managed service provider that may not give you as much access to it as you want. And it doesn't necessarily contextualize parts of the network that are not on the WAN. For instance, the local area network. Maybe you want a tool that monitors the LAN and the WAN and allows you to do hop-by-hop analysis across all of that, or end-to-end analysis of latency, jitter, and packet loss. Be like, oh, it looks like the problem's actually my Wi-Fi, not my SD-WAN overlay. Your third-party tool is going to give you that global view. And we did mention lots of other factors like data granularity, data quality, data retention. Those are all things that don't necessarily make you give an F to your visibility in your SD-WAN solution, but it does push you to supplement it. And when I mean supplement, when I say supplement, you think about the fact, like, how many tools do you already have to manage, monitor, and troubleshoot your networks? When I ask that question of a typical NetOps team, they usually say anywhere from 4 to 15 tools. There's never just one tool that addresses all their needs. I've talked to people that have 75 tools or 30 tools for monitoring and managing networks. So, and you also I've also seen in the past that like people who are like a NOC technician, someone that's like tier 1 support in the network operations center, they are usually more satisfied, from what I've seen, with that monitoring capability of SD-WAN, whereas like the people that are in the network engineering group that are getting like tier 2, tier 3 support tickets forwarded to them, escalated to them from the NOC, they've in the past, I didn't see it in this one, but in previous research projects I've seen, them being, actually maybe I did see it in this one, I can't remember, but I've seen it over the years that the people who are responsible for like digging into the data, doing the hard work of troubleshooting complex issues, are less likely to be satisfied with with the native network monitoring capabilities of SD-WAN, because they just have more demands of their tools. They want to dig into things that a lot of the frontline NetOps people are not necessarily going to do. And so that's an issue that drives them to use a third-party tool.
Thanks, Shamus. Let's take one more question. Why is WAN acceleration important to a SASE migration?
Okay, so I think I touched on this a little bit, but like when you're thinking about like you're thinking about like how you're going to connect your sites into your SASE POPs and your SASE POPs into your cloud or your data center or whatnot. You want to make sure that that traffic is optimized as much as possible. And I think what we're seeing is that like people want to optimize when people are optimizing their overall SD-WAN and WAN performance with a WAN acceleration solution, it also optimizes whatever latency might be added or introduced by the SASE POP sitting in between, your users and the applications. There's a lot of discussion about how, from an architectural perspective, how SASE needs to be a single pass architecture where like the network data as it goes through the SASE POP, it's one process, multiple security checks, right? As opposed to like multiple security checks, the traffic passing through multiple layers of technology and adding more latency and more opportunities for errors and so forth. So there's some vendors that do that single pass architecture. There are other vendors that have, integrated multiple siloed solutions into a suite of products that deliver SASE. And that's a point of contention that some people focus on in SASE. What I think is if you're using WAN acceleration to optimize how traffic goes from your user edge to the SASE POP and then on to the cloud or the data center or whatever, that can mitigate some of the issues that might happen if your SASE POPs are adding latency to the network.
Great. Thank you for taking those questions, Shamus. And I wanted to thank our audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. Be on the lookout for that email from EMA, and I hope that we'll see you at a future EMA research webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.